is that anyone can become a refugee. It could happen to any of us. And it is really important to understand what has happened with the refugees that exist and the special day, inshallah. So yeah, so tell us about what shifted your maybe passion, or what are the events in your life or things that you've encountered when you've worked with refugees yourself?
So one of the most shocking points is just what you just said, that any of us can become a refugee. So if you talk to any of the refugees, whether they're from Syria, recently from Ukraine, or even from Sudan, they will all tell you that we never thought that something like this would happen to us. And so it's really important to think about that and think about how blessed we are wherever we live, because even if you talk to like the Syrian president or my uncle who's lived in Syria his whole life, they never expected the Syrian crisis to erupt back in 2011. And now today, Syria is the source of the largest number of refugees in the world. There's more than 6 million Syrian refugees scattered throughout the world. There's 6 million Syrian displaced people, internally displaced in Syria, and that's half of the population of Syria. And even if we think about what happened in Ukraine, even though when we here in the United States were hearing the saber rattling, we were hearing that Russia is going to invade Ukraine. So I think for us, it wasn't shocking when Russia actually invaded Ukraine. But if you talk to the Ukrainians that were on the ground, they were also shocked. And then the same thing in Sudan. What's happening in Sudan right now, that's a source of refugees also. More than 250,000 Sudanese refugees have left the country in the last few months. If you talk to anybody who is living in Sudan on the ground, they will say, we never expected something like this to happen. So recognizing that for our own selves, that, one day you could be a refugee, and we shouldn't think like, oh, all that conflict is over there and that something like that will never happen to us, because that's what they thought too. They thought something like this will never happen to us. So that's kind of one of the major things that shook me when I went on my first medical mission. When I met woman after woman saying something like, I was a regular middle class homemaker, or I was working and I was taking care of my children. And I kept thinking to myself, well, that's me. I'm a regular mom working, taking care of my children. And I just kept imagining like what would happen to me if something like that erupted. And I ended up in a refugee camp with my 2 little children at the time. I only had 2 on my first mission. And being a mom was freshly in my head because my children were so young. They were 2 and 1 when I left on my first mission. And just imagining like taking care of your hygiene, being newly postpartum, because there were some women that were delivering babies. They were 38 weeks pregnant, 37 weeks pregnant when they became refugees and had to come and move into a refugee camp and then get sent to the hospital, deliver a baby, and come back after a few days. And then thinking about like, how are these women taking care of themselves and trying to get enough adequate nutrition and hydration to produce breast milk to nurse these babies. And not to mention, they usually had other kids, or a lot of times their husbands were injured. Until taking care of a household in a refugee camp, like that just boggled my mind. And it was just so difficult to imagine that could easily happen to any of us. And what would we want somebody to do if that did happen to us?